Going to come out to the water park and play dominoes, you better watch out for Miss Van. Last time she had 3 or 4 dominoes under her chair that she couldn't account for. I kid because I care. That's right. I was going to preach all the way through chapter 6, but then I knew the next week would be a business meeting, so I figured I would also save verse 6 and following because it talked about tithing, and then I realized I wasn't going to be preaching next Sunday morning anyway, so it was all for naught. But hey, if we end early, can we bring the lights up? It's a little dark right here. Either that or my eyes are failing me. There we go. If we finish early, we get to beat the Methodists to the white meat, right? Y'all are catching on. It's funnier when you laugh, isn't it? Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6. Starting in verse 1, we will read to verse 5. Galatians chapter 6, starting in verse 1. I also owe you guys some minutes from last week. I realized I went a little long last week, so hopefully these 5 verses will limit my time to where I can give you, probably not. So, chapter 6, starting in verse 1. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in the spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. For we each will have to bear his own load. Seems very simple. Been talking about the last chapter, chapter 5, kind of starts talking about the life in the Spirit. The reason why legalism is so dangerous is that it extinguishes the life of the Spirit. And we saw last week, I'm going to loosen this tie for a minute because while it is not as hot as it's been, it's still warm for me, but we'll be okay. And in the life of the Spirit, the reason why legalism is so dangerous is because it quells that. And we saw last week that the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And then it gives a list of the fruits of the flesh, and these are in opposition to one another. And the thing is, when we live in the Spirit, we have no need of this thing called the law that has held us in prison until Christ comes. And so we continue on in how the believer is to walk. If the believer chooses to walk in law, Christ's death, the offense of Christ's death has no meaning. But if we walk in the Spirit, then we walk in a life according to Him, and we then demonstrate that life as we live through the fruits of the Spirit. And therefore it is unnecessary to have a law written that we must follow. These things we follow because the Spirit indwells us. You say, well, what happens when you run into somebody that fails? How do we handle that? So we love, unfortunately, when people fall. You say, that's not true, really? It's not Crystal Cathedral, that's another one. D. James Kennedy's church in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He is long since retired. The current pastor there just stepped down last week due to a marital affair. And half the people were happy to see him go. Coral Ridge. Half the people were happy to see him go. And a lot of people were saying, see, just goes to prove that men of God can't be trusted. And the other half were very saddened that this man who was a very well-known, very well-liked pastor fell into a situation of corruption, and he had to step down. So we like it when people fail because we feel better about ourselves. This is an old cliche. I'm sure you've heard it over and over. If you haven't, you will with me here. The Christian army is the only army that executes its wounded. We are far less about binding wounds and healing torn and broken bodies than we are about demonstrating how good we are by shooting all the people that screwed up. And that is a life of legalism. That is a life under the law. Why? Because the consequences of breaking the law was what? Death. You've sinned, bang. It's easy. It's efficient. And what happens is it's a great way to delineate within our lives just how good we are. But notice what Paul says here in this passage. Check out the language that Paul says. And the reason why legalism is so necessary with this point, the reason why the Christian shoots its life, is because we bring to the world, a fallen and hurt humanity, legalism instead of grace. Now, we all want grace when we're the one in the hot seat. I've known people like that. Oh, let's max this kid out in the Army. Let's max this kid out. But when they get in trouble, hey, could you go talk to my chain of command for me and see if they'll be lenient? We see this with politicians. You ever seen a Senate or House Representative meeting where people have screwed up and they're in the hot seat, but when they screw up, oh, let's not make a mountain out of a molehill here. It was just a small error. We bring to a fallen humanity, instead of grace, we bring to a fallen humanity cold, hard law. Something Christ doesn't do to us. Why? Because we're all deserving of death. Check out what Paul says here. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in spirit and gentleness. One way of looking at it, another way of translating it, if a brother has been seized upon, has fallen into a trap of transgression, if he willfully jumped in with both feet, Paul says, take him out back and beat him till he's senseless. Paul says, well, we're going to have to ask you to leave the church. Paul says, hey, ostracize the person because they're one of them. You know, I caught him drinking. I caught him going to an R-rated movie. You should hear the music he listens to. So what Paul says. But yet that is a common response within the church, is ostracizing. One of the reasons why millennials want nothing to do with the church, folks, is because we live a dual standard that they see. And they look and say, I can get this from any other religion. Why would I want yours? And we fail to demonstrate the grace of Jesus Christ because what they have seen by their own life is cold, hard law coming to meet them every time they screw up. What does Paul say? You who are spiritual, restore in a spirit of harshness, a spirit of I'm holier than you, a spirit of I'm glad that I'm more sanctified than you because I would never have fallen for that because my life is so much cleaner than yours. So what Paul says? A spirit of gentleness. Notice the phraseology here. If you're caught in a transgression, you who are spiritual. Now this indicates a mature believer, not a mature person. We all know people who are mature in age and not mature enough in their mental. Okay, I'll raise my hand with that one. I'm 40-something. 44. 45 in September. Steph knows my social security number. I call her. I'm 45 soon. I behave not like I'm... Looks like we'll be headed to the beating the Methodists to the white meat earlier than that. This happened last week too. I'm starting to sense a common thread here. My mic's out. That's okay. Quiet, Timmy. Does your mommy know you're out here playing music leader? I was going somewhere brilliant with that. Oh, there it is. Wasn't me either. I'm 45. But I probably, if you've ever seen me at my weirdest, probably don't behave like I'm 45. This isn't about being older. This is about being spiritually mature. Why? Grace is something that you have through maturity. If you watch young Christians, man, they have so much enthusiasm, but they also come with a very concrete thinking, right? Just like your kids. You can't use abstract concept with small children. I've tried. It's hard. You look at me like going, it's just like basic logic, and they just stare back at you like you're speaking a foreign language. And so it's not necessarily something that a younger person is capable of doing. But it doesn't mean that a young person can't be spiritually mature. It is talking about the maturity level of the individual's spirituality, not their age bracket. And so you have a distinction there. When I was a machinist, there's two types of machinists. One is a machinist that has done the same job for 19 years. And then there's machinists that have done multiple jobs within the factory for 19 years. Both use the same moniker. Both are two totally different people. Paul's statement is, you who are spiritually mature, who are able to look at situations and bring grace to the table instead of law. Now, this does not mean that there are no repercussions for sin. It's not what this is saying. David is a classic example of this. David steals Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. David is in a place he should never have been. He then steals the man's wife, sleeps with the man's wife, then murders the man to cover up the crime. David, by his actions, deserves death. Nathan comes to David and tells this cute story about a little ewe lamb. And David becomes incensed. And David jumps up and brings grace to the equation? No. David brings law. The man that did this will surely die. And then Nathan goes, well, guess what, Cochise? It's you. See, we all have law. We all want to bring law. Notice how God treats David. Does David die? No. But David's sons pay the penalty for David's crime. There isn't a consequence-free action here. But notice what's brought to David. David is under ban of death instantaneously. But he is dealt with gracefully, even though he responds with great amount of law. See, legalism and sacerdotalism has only one answer. Transgression, penalty. Transgression, penalty. Transgression, penalty. Life in the Spirit, a life that's walked in the Spirit, recognizes that I'm just a guilty schlub like everybody else is. And therefore, when a neighbor falls or when a brother falls, I can have two choices. I can bring law to them and crush them. Or I can extend grace. Because that's what was extended to me. You who are spiritual, restore. The word restore here is like taking a broken limb, binding the limb, and bringing it back to 100% health. Not amputation. We like amputation. It's quicker. You who are spiritually mature, cut them off. There are churches that do that. There are churches that practice the operation of ostracification. I just made that word up. It's where you ostracize plurally. Just roll with it, people. Where you ostracize. Where you keep people at distance because, well, they've broken the rules. Folks, when you get to realize that we all break the rules, we can quit doing that mess. Bring restoration. Bind a broken wound to bring healing. How? In a spirit of gentleness. In a spirit of gentleness. Why? Keep watch on yourself lest you too be tempted, because you can fall into a same or similar trap. Keep watch on your arrogance and assume that you won't fall for the same trap. Really? Take that high-powered gaze you use to gaze at your neighbor's life and judge them and turn it internal and see how long you leave that light on. Keep watch lest you too be tempted. Why? Because we're to bear one another's burdens. And in so doing, we fulfill the law of Christ. 3 things. Notice there. First of all, our actions are to be restorative, not punitive. Go look at all the issues on church discipline. Go and look at 1 Corinthians 5. When it says, turn the man's soul over to Satan. Why? So that you might be able to save his soul. The purpose of that is even to be restorative. Go look at Matthew 18. Where it talks about church discipline. And the first thing is, go and talk to the person that you may what? Win them over. We don't like that part. We just want to go and shoot them. It's quicker. I got it. The guy doing 40 miles an hour last night and a 65 on the way home, it'd have been far faster to have shot him. We would have saved the world a lot of heartache. Yeah. But that's not proper. I mean, I wouldn't be here Sunday morning. I'd be having one heck of a jail ministry, but I wouldn't be here. Three things. First one is to restore the individual. As the person who is spiritually mature, our first priority is restorative. Our second priority is to keep watch on ourselves, to ensure that ourselves do not make the same problems. I know that was a bad sentence, but I went to public schools. We don't fall into the same trap or a similar trap. Folks, most sins, adultery, theft, drunkenness, whatever, come from a sense of entitlement. What eventually gets us enticed is we believe we deserve it. You go look at the very first sin. It says, and Eve saw that the fruit was good for food and was desirous to make one wise. And so she took and she ate. Self-entitlement usually feeds our sinful nature. And one of the roads to self-entitlement is arrogance. Keep watch over yourself, lest you fall into the same trap by looking at your neighbor and going, what a moron you were. I'm so glad I'm so holy. It's a path to destruction. It's a path to self-entitlement. I know many military leaders got arrested, or not arrested, but relieved for believing that they were owed it. Last one is to bear one another's burdens. It's to carry the load of the broken-hearted person who's caught in the transgression. Notice it says nothing about ostracizing them. Picking them up and carrying their load. If they're carrying a heavy load, instead of making them carry it as their wound is mending, as their leg is mending, you take stuff out of their pack and you put it into yours. so that the leg will mend and that they can heal. Those are the 3 steps of what it takes to bring restoration. The first purpose is those who are spiritual go and restore them gently. 2, we keep an eye on our own heart, lest we fall into the same snare. 3, we bear the burdens. Notice there's no law there. Notice there's no legalism there. Notice there's no sacerdotalism there. Notice there's nothing there but simply grace. Now, it doesn't excuse the action. It doesn't eliminate the consequences for the action. But instead of executing people for the crime, we come alongside them. Imagine the transformative power of the Church of Jesus Christ if every church in America would practice those 3 simple steps. But we don't. And the world watches us. And we now have an incongruency issue because the life we say we believe and the life we say we live, we do not follow. And they watch us, folks. They watch us. If anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Folks, this is great advice. When we understand that our state in life is a wretched thing, we will not have such a high opinion of ourselves. If you ask me on a certain day, I've got a real high opinion of myself. You don't need to laugh there, Miss Van. I heard you. We were talking about this on Wednesday night. The Bible uses the term sheep to describe us. And when we think sheep, unless you live around sheep, you think this cute, white, fluffy, little cute thing that and you stroke, and it's cute. I was telling them one time, and we were in Kuwait at the time. We were on a range, and all of a sudden, this odor appeared. And I looked at people around me, and they're all looking at each other, and I'm like going, wasn't me. And all of a sudden we hear ceasefire, 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 and then you see a little black dot, and the odor gets stronger. And you see a bunch of little black dots, and the odor is getting very foul. And the poor shepherd of these sheep had to have no olfactory nerves left, because at 300 yards, the smell was so much that we were about ready to retch. I don't want us like to walk with them. But they come along, and they walk across the range, and the smell just intensifies as it gets, I mean, it's like a skunk on steroids. I mean, just, They were sheep. Sheep were also not the smartest animals in the barnyard. I think for humorous reasons, God made one with the self-defense mechanism of when it's attacked by a predator, it passes out. Think about that for just a minute. I'm attacked by a lion, and I'll lay down and pass out. That seems like easy pickings to me. That's sheep. Dumb, smelly things. That's the phraseology that's used to describe us. When we recognize that our lives are dumb, smelly, wretched things before a holy God, and we recognize that we ourselves are flawed individuals that sin repeatedly and have need of putting to death the deeds of the flesh repeatedly. When we look at a neighbor that falls into sin, and we look through the eyes of the flawed, dumb, smelly things we are that are offensive to a holy God, it's hard to reach out with law because we're just as wretched. When you think you are something when you are not, Folks, when we believe our own press that we are good. Why? Because I've kept this nice long list. I have this list of things I keep, and I'm good. Look, I didn't drink, I didn't smoke, I don't chip, I don't chew, and I don't date girls that do. I don't go to movies, I don't listen to music. I don't live. My house is nothing more than carpet and a wall with no TV in it. And only certain books, but not those other books. And I'm good. Then we sit and look at ourselves and we have a higher opinion of ourselves. And when people fail, we come to them with our opinion of ourselves instead of the natural look of ourselves. Foul, smelly things that the Son of God hung on the tree to buy back. And so when it comes time to deal with another person that the Son of God has redeemed back, our responsibility is not to think highly of ourselves and shoot them where they stand, but to mend the wound and carry the load. The church would be on fire if it simply did those three things. Now we come to a very confusing passage. Verse 4. A lot of people like this passage because it seems to represent the other side. The problem is context. But let each one of you test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone, not in his neighbor. Ha-ha! I can boast in my good works. Yeah. It would be if you ripped this out of context and it was context-free. Sure, great. But it's preceded with, when you think you are something when you are nothing, you deceive yourself. If you look over at Matthew chapter 7, it talks about the individual who says, let me remove the speck from your eye. And the guy says, wait, why don't you take the big beam out of your eye and then you can take out the speck out of my eye. When we look at our lives and we test, we prove. What does the word prove mean? This is what is a term in metallurgy to demonstrate that the mineral or the metal that you're working with is certifiable. It's pure. When you test your motives, when you test your actions, and they are proved pure, check that out. Then you have a reason to boast in yourself and not in your neighbor. What does that mean? It's not sitting here going, well, my works are pure, but my neighbors are not. Conversely, he's arguing the exact opposite. I'm not using my neighbor as justification for my good works. I'm not using my neighbor's example as to why I'm a good man. I'm not using my neighbor as the checklist for why I'm holier than them. I have been about putting to death the deeds of the flesh on a daily basis to where what happens in my life has been tested and proven through the work of the Spirit. This is the overall context of the passage, to where when I look at my neighbor, I don't judge myself in light of his sinful, wicked ways. Therefore, I'm a good man. I look at the internal life that I live and whether or not it is congruent with life in the Spirit, and the boasting is in the life in the Spirit, not the wretched state of my neighbor. But oh, how quickly we want to grab that verse and switch it. For each of you will have to bear his own load. He says, bear one another's burdens. Now he's talking about us bearing our own load. Folks, we all have our own burdens. We all have our own loads. We all have our own sins. We all have our own sins that trip us up. We all suffer in different areas. We all have a weakness and a bend in a direction where the devil knows where to shoot us every time to make us fall. And that is the burden we all must bear. But when an individual is caught in a transgress, we're to help bind and help carry. Mindful that we all have a rucksack full of garbage. We all have a backpack full of sin. Now we all have a bag full of wretchedness that offends a holy God. And the great news about what Paul is teaching us is that our response should be the exact same response that the Father demonstrates by the sending of the Son into the world, to where we can say, Father, and be met with grace when we don't deserve it. You who are spiritual, you who are spiritually mature, restore with gentleness, bearing one another's burdens. Imagine the impact the Church Universal would have on the world if we were restorative in our actions, self-examining in our motives, and bearing of other people's burdens. Let's pray. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity today to hear your word. Heavenly Father, as the praise band comes and sings this morning, we ask that there's someone here this morning that has lived a life of law, lived a life of good deeds, but yet has never experienced a relationship with you where grace is extended. I ask that during this time that they would come forward. And Father, I ask you to be with each and every one of us here, that as we look at our own lives and do self-examination, ask ourselves the hard question, am I law-based in my reaction to people, or am I grace-based? We ask for these things in your name we pray. Amen. If you'll please stand as the praise